At issue this week, the fight over the carbon tax and accusations not all Canadians are being treated equally.
It's the federal government that has created two classes of taxpayer by providing an exemption for heating.
The Conservatives calling on the government to drop it altogether.
Let's pause the carbon tax on all home heating until Canadians go to the polls.
The Prime Minister says that's not going to happen.
There will absolutely not be any other carve-outs or suspensions of the price on pollution.
But can he stick with that promise? So was the pause on home heating oil a mistake for the Liberals? Will they be able to appease Western provinces? I'm Rosemary Barton, here to break it down this evening. Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne, Althia Raj, and Kelly Kreiderman joins us tonight from Alberta. Chantal, let's start with you. I mean, when we talked about this last week, we all seemed to be surprised and predicted that some of what we've seen over the past week would happen. What have you made of the response from provinces and the opposition?
I have seen no response that was not totally predictable, which makes this a self-inflicted wound by the Liberals. And it's not just the usual suspects. Of course, premiers in the prairies in Saskatchewan and Alberta were going to say what they said. But the damage goes well beyond that. It extends to Ontario, a critical market for the Liberals. It extends to NDP leaders. Going west, the new Premier of Manitoba, the Rachel Notley in Edmonton, the leader of the NDP in Saskatchewan, are all saying the same thing as their premiers are saying, for obvious reasons. The only person who seemed to get wind in his sails from this announcement was Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. I know that Atlantic MPs believe they'll benefit from that. They'll suspend judgment. But I don't expect the polls to see a great revival of the Liberals in Atlantic Canada on that basis.
And in fact, Andrew, the Conservatives are trying to push this into next week with an opposition day motion that the NDP has said they will support, which is probably damaging as well. To Chantal's point, they've managed to upset a whole lot of people with this.
Yeah, I mean, you telegraph weakness by doing it, and you weaken yourself further after you've done it. I can't imagine a worse set of circumstances, worse type of choice. You not only have validated or seeming to validate the main criticism put out by the opposition to the tax that it was making life unaffordable, which is in fact not true. There's a rebate for it, and if, to the extent it was true, you could simply increase the rebate. But you've also, introduced a note of uncertainty. People are going to be increasingly uncertain whether they should invest in the kinds of things that the carbon tax is supposed to incentivize if they don't think it's going to be sticking around. You're giving a tax break to the dirtier type of fuel, but not to the cleaner type of fuel. It's regressive. The more you spend heating your house, the more the tax break you get. It just doesn't fit with any kind of principle of either fairness or equity, on top of all the things with the demands for the further carve-outs. Yeah. And for what? Do they really think they're going to save their Atlantic seats by doing this? Let me tell you what's going to happen in the next election campaign. All of those Atlantic Canadian MPs are going to be asked, is the tax slated to come back on in 3 years at basically it'll have to catch up to the price it was supposed to be, so it's going to be triple or whatever it's going to be by that point. Are you going to vote for that when it comes in? Is this just going to be a temporary reprieve to type of save your seats? And they're all going to squirm when they're asked that question.
Well, except everyone will have a home heating pump, so it won't be an issue. I mean, that's the idea, right? Althea, what have you made of the response?
But they will still have to pay
the
carbon tax on the electricity heat from the heat pump. The bigger problem in Atlantic Canada is not the carbon tax. It will be if Justin Trudeau is still on the ballot in the next election. You ask the MPs, the real MPs, and they will tell you that. It's not the carbon tax. I think we need to decouple a few things. So as far as I know, there is no disagreement on the doubling of the rural tax credit. Everybody seems to be happy about that. Yeah. And in fact, there seems to be genuine agreement, especially among the environmental critics of the government, on the home heating pump benefits. What they're really talking about is that 3-year reprieve. And personally, I don't know why it needed to be 3 years. I do agree, I think Chantal raised this last point, like why are you going to the election on this idea that you're going to bring it back? Maybe it could have been 1 year in order to incentivize people to do it and then, push them to change. That's really what we're talking about. But I have to say, I find the arguments a little petty from our provincial premiers. Like, We have different programs for different needs across the country all the time. And we are talking about people, especially in Atlantic Canada, who tend to be quite poor, who are on outdated, old, expensive systems. And it's not wrong, I believe, for the federal government to try to help them to make better environmental decisions and to help them along with that. And I think that it's okay for some people to benefit if you don't benefit as well. And I think as a country, we need to accept that.
Chantal, quickly, and then I want to get Kelly in.
Except that the federal government, this is a signature policy of the federal government. It's not some side issue in the fine print of a federal budget. For 3 days before that announcement, the Environment Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, was making the argument that you could not start to have one carbon pricing regimen for one region or one type of fuel and not for the others, because it would lack coherence. And the federal government argued as much in the Supreme Court and actually won a pass from the Supreme Court for its carbon pricing, because the court admitted that it required a national solution. A national solution is not a pick and choose, especially when you look at the way the choice is made, which it's not a coincidence that this choice favors Atlantic Canada, where the
I know, but it
Liberals
doesn't just
are
apply in Atlantic Canada. I think it's important to stress that.
there
Otherwise,
are
it would be illegal.
There
I got it.
there are other ways to help Atlantic Canadians with heating costs and to lift the carbon tax from heating oil.
I got to get Kelly in. Kelly.
It's a nakedly political decision. A 3-year pause in the carbon price on home heating oil might as well be a forever pause. The Liberals' moral authority on climate lay with a Supreme Court ruling saying it had the right to set a minimum across the country. Right now, they're not even following their own minimum. And if we're talking about affordability, there are affordability issues. There are more lower income people in Atlantic Canada, but there are low income people across the country who are dealing with affordability issues. And you have a situation where we have a provincial premier who's threatening to break the law, and he has some sympathy from climate and energy advocates because they see an issue of fairness here. And that seems to be, I know the Liberals are saying right now, no more carve-outs, but it does seem untenable to offer something that primarily benefits one part of rural Canada and doesn't benefit other rural parts of Canada.
Andrew, then Chantal, then Althia.
Yeah,
Andrew.
the moral basis of redistribution is from rich to poor, not from west to east. If people are experiencing, if there are people who are experiencing affordability issues on this, then increase the rebate. Don't give a tax break that everybody, rich or poor, benefits from. And in fact, the richest benefit the most from. The more you spend, the more you gain from it. And you only essentially, effectively do that for one region of the country. For another, that doesn't pass any kind of test of either efficiency or equity.
Chantal.
And then you look at this, does this improve the predicament or solve the predicament of the government? It does not. Here is the government being pushed for more carve-outs and saying, no, we won't. Well, no, we won't, perhaps, but if they do, they're going to lose their environment minister. And then things continue to unravel. An announcement that did not have the support of the majority in cabinet, by the way, and that was produced under duress and threat of resignation of MPs, only makes Justin Trudeau a hostage not only to the NDP in the House of Commons, but to his own caucus.
Althia.
Yes.
Well, Mr. Guilbeault may have to resign because there will be another carve-out most likely. Bill C-23, which is a farm drying bill, is basically another carve-out, and it looks like it's going to pass the Senate and come back to the House. And it had majority opposition support, so the government will be breaking its word yet again, not by their own will, but they will be forced to. I want to bring in the point about the NDP siding with the Conservatives, which you raised off the top, because I think it's worthwhile noting. I think it does, not that the NDP doesn't care about the environment, but the NDP has traditionally been weaker than the Liberals have been on the environment as long as this government has gone in this direction. I think what it really shows is that the NDP is far more worried about the Conservatives than the Liberals. I think that's worth noting. But I do agree with, I think, Andrew and Chantal's point off the top that the real damage is to the government's climate plan. What happens to that? But that was always going to happen if Pierre Poilievre wins the next election and gets rid of carbon pricing.
30 seconds to you, Kelly.
I think the NDP is siding with the Conservatives because they do have some support in key rural ridings where they will get clobbered on this. And I think, one of the things that has also come out of this is bringing attention to other regional carve-outs that already exist. We are talking about a cap on oil and gas in the West. We are talking about we are talking about a lower carbon price in Quebec by having a different system. This was an imperfect system. What this has brought attention to is it has clearly been manipulated by politics. And that is what the Liberals have always pushed back against. They have said there is some sanctity here, and now that sanctity is gone, and now the questions will come on everything.
Okay, I got to leave it there. When we come back, though, we're going to take a look at how any of this fits into Justin Trudeau's job as leader of the Liberal Party. Does the carbon tax reversal hit Trudeau's leadership? What about some comments just today or the past couple of days? We'll talk about that next on The National. Longtime Liberal and Senator Percy Down says his party needs a new leader before the next election, something the Prime Minister is dismissing.
He's calling on you to step down.
Sorry, who's that?
Senator Down, a former former staffer for Jean
Percy.
Percy.
Oh, yeah. How's he doing?
He wants you to quit.
Oh, well. I wish him all the best in the work that he's doing.
So should the PM be concerned about his leadership? Chantal, Andrew, Althia, and Kelly are back. Now, the response was chef's kiss, I think, would be the right answer there, Andrew. But there is something more serious that the Prime Minister probably also needs to think about.
Yeah, I mean, up until 2 weeks ago, I would have said probably he'll stumble through the next election. I'm not as sure of that now. The reason this all has happened, the reason they brought in this carbon tax thing was because they're so low in the polls. They are probably going to sink further as a result of this. I would not be surprised to find. And so people who might have bit their tongues until now, I think are getting a little worried. And at some point, we always have this question, do you make things worse for yourself by changing leaders before an election? And oftentimes you would say, better to stick with the old leader. At some point, the numbers can be so bad that you think, okay, anything must be better than this. And I'll just say, I don't think Percy Down was only speaking for himself when he made that comment, and I suspect we're going to hear other shoes dropping.
Chantal.
Well, Percy Down is clearly not a member of the Palace Guard or the inner circle of the Prime Minister.
Yes.
Let's agree on that. He is a former Chief of Staff to Jean Chrétien, and he is safe in the Senate. And it's always easier to speak like that from the safety of a Senate seat than a House of Commons seat. But I agree with Andrew. Percy Down said out loud or wrote what many Liberals are saying behind the scenes, that maybe it's time for Trudeau to go, that he's outlasting his welcome, and that he's a liability that is increasingly weighing down any chances of survival for the Liberals in the next election. I think today what unnerved Mr. Trudeau's people even more, though, than this Percy Down business, was Mark Carney telling the Globe and Mail that, I have not ruled out running for the leadership. It's never great to have someone who is considered or would be considered a star candidate say, well, the job is not open, but if it were open, I'm available, I'm in the window, especially since Mr. Carney is also earlier this week said about the carbon carve-out, you would have not gone down that particular road.
Yeah. Althia.
Well, this is not the first time Senator Down has said this. He said this publicly last March, just before
on your
the
podcast.
Liberal convention. Yes. He and before that, he said it to my colleague Alex Ballingal at the Star. And there wasn't like a floodgate of Liberals that decided to risk their political careers to say something. So I'm not sure that we're going to see the MPs who whisper behind closed doors and in your ear that they're really unhappy with the Prime Minister. But what I think has changed in the last 2 months is that MPs have told the Prime Minister directly. At that London caucus meeting, they, at least two that I'm aware of, stood up at the microphone and told the Prime Minister they thought he should go. That takes a lot of guts to say that.
Yep.
And those voices are getting louder and louder. And so I just feel like the Prime Minister has decided not to listen to these people because I think the people around him are telling him that he can still overcome this challenge.
Yeah.
That advice may change in the months to come.
Kelly.
I asked the same question about Justin Trudeau and the Liberals that I asked about Rachel Notley and the Alberta NDP here. What is the party without her? What is the party without him? And I think, would their policy on carbon pricing change substantially if Justin Trudeau was replaced by someone else? Would they be further ahead in addressing affordability issues instead of 18 months behind like they are now if they had a different leader? And I don't know, I don't have a clear answer on that. And I think until we know, until we hear from more of the Mark Carneys who are tire kicking obviously right now, I think we need to have a better idea of who will replace Justin Trudeau before we have an idea of whether Liberals and Liberal MPs want the Prime Minister to go. He is so much of the brand. He brought the party back from the political wilderness, and I think it is nobody. I think still most people don't want to push someone like that out the door especially without having a clear successor in mind.
Chantal and then Andrew quickly.
But of course, despair brings people to think desperate things. Remember that the Liberals back in the day believed that John Turner would save them in '84, and he did not. Or Kim Campbell and the Conservatives, famously after Brian Mulroney. Parties play to win, and they will believe in whatever gives them hopes of winning.
Sure will, yeah.
Even if it defies all logic, even if the past suggests that you're better off with the old horse than to have one that will end up at the glue factory really quickly. I think a lot of Liberals believe that Mark Carney, for instance, would bring more fiscal rigor, would set the carbon pricing policy back on its feet. They could be right, they could be wrong.
Yeah.
Problem with the argument of it would be nice to know before deciding whether Trudeau should go or stay. The problem is you're not going to know this unless Trudeau quits.
30 seconds to you, Andrew.
Despair makes people do brutal things too. It won't be a swift kill, but they have absolutely the power to make his life miserable over the next few weeks and months. The Atlantic Caucus basically bullied him into making this change. Not that it will save their hides, but you've got a lot of other MPs in exposed positions who now can look at this and go, aha, he's vulnerable. We can push him. We can push for things that we want to try and save our skins. It's going to be a bad next few months if he does stay on.
We've got to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll look at Canada's new immigration targets and what they could mean for our economy. That's next. After years of increasing its immigration targets, the government is now holding firm with 500,000 new permanent residents in 2026. The immigration minister says it is needed, but issues around housing and healthcare must also be considered.
These immigration levels allow us to bring in the skills and talent we need to fill the labour gaps and ensure Canada's economic prosperities.
So what do we make of these new immigration targets? Do they make sense for the country, particularly in the middle of a housing crisis? Let's bring everybody back. Chantal, Andrew, Althia, and Kelly. Althia, why don't you start us off on this one? Obviously, the government is aware and thinking about the housing crisis as it chooses these immigration targets for 2026. But I'm not sure that it seems still very high. I'll put it that way, given that we are in this moment right now.
I feel like I'm not qualified enough to say what the targets should be. Yeah. I know the Business Council would have liked the proportion to change to have more economic newcomers as opposed to as many family class or What I hope is that the government, and I do believe Mark Miller knows this, supports the integration of newcomers so that we don't see stories with asylum seekers having to sleep in homeless shelters. So that there is still a popular support for having Canada as a multi-ethnic country that is welcoming to newcomers, that is still support for immigrants, that there is still a pathway, and we've seen this, there's general agreement on giving temporary foreign workers a pathway to citizenship, that those like key markers of Canadian identity and the values that we share continue to be supported.
Chantal.
Oh, the first thing that the government has a duty to preserve is a Canadian difference with a lot of comparable countries, and that is a generally positive take on the part of voters towards immigration. And that is reflected in large part by the relative political consensus in the House of Commons. You didn't hear the Conservatives rise up and say this is too much, or immigration is at this point an issue where there is bi or tripartisan support and consensus. That being said, I'm not inclined to spend a lot of time discussing Liberal policies that extend to 2026 for the obvious reason that I will use my brain on them after the election if they're still around.
Okay, that's good advice for me going forward. That's how I'm going to do it too. Andrew.
I was struck by the announcement the minister made the day before he announced the targets, where he said, well, we're now going to take into account what's happening in the housing market, what's happening in healthcare. You might say they might have been doing that a long time before this. I don't think anybody knows what the right level of immigration is, but if you're going to have whatever level of immigration, you might have got to make sure you're allocating the resources to match it. The problem is not that we have too many people. The problem is that we're not building enough houses. The problem is that we've got very low rates of investment. And therefore low productivity growth. The problem is we've got a messed up healthcare system that has been badly in need of reform. All of these problems long predated the recent surge in immigration. But what has happened is with these increased immigration numbers, it's really exposed the costs of these programs. It's made them much more urgent. And we're now actually, hallelujah, starting to talk seriously about changing some of them. We've made more progress in fixing housing policy in the last 3 weeks or 3 months than we did in the previous 30 years. So yeah, maybe sometimes you need a crisis before you start to get serious about these things. And if so, then I'm all in favor of these levels of immigration.
Kelly, last word to you.
I like that Mark Miller said it's not about Canadians being xenophobic, it's about them wanting us to get our stuff together. And I think that's true. And I think he addressed some of the low-hanging fruit this week, talking about the number of permanent residents and leaving that as it is for now for the next 3 years. I think the bigger question for the federal Liberals is how they deal with temporary workers, students, those over 2 million people that are in the country temporarily that, according to some reports, they haven't properly kept track of every time. I think that is the bigger question, and the minister did speak about having to deal with that next, or having to address that next. And I think that's the thornier, that's the sticky wicket for the federal Liberals.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you all very much for weighing in on that subject too, and that's At Issue for this week. Don't forget, you can catch The National on YouTube and CBC Gem, and you can watch me Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. Eastern on Rosemary Barton Live. Thanks for watching. See you back here next week, if not before.